Hello everybody, Jeremy Dickinson here. Thank you for watching. In this video I want to take some time to talk about John Stuart Mill's famous work, Utilitarianism. So John Stuart Mill, 19th century British philosopher. He is in the British empiricist tradition, and he's someone who, for the purposes of this video, we're going to focus on his ethical theory. So I want to take some time to talk about his work, Utilitarianism, which is the name of his ethical theory. Now, let me see if I could just set up some of John Stuart Mill's ethical theory by saying some general things about ethical theory, and then what kind of theory generally utilitarianism is, and then go on to say some things about utilitarianism, that work by John Stuart Mill itself. Okay, so when we do an ethical theory, for those of you who've seen my other videos, you have a sense of this already, but those of you who haven't, when you do an ethical theory, you want a theory of what counts as good, what counts as bad, you want a theory of what counts as right, what counts as wrong, okay, and you want a whole host of other things. But significantly, when one develops an ethical theory, you want an account of goodness, badness, rightness, and wrongness, okay, to springboard from to do other things in the ethical theory. So we call the theory of goodness and badness a theory of value. We call a theory of rightness and wrongness a theory of normativity, a theory of right action. Okay, so when we're studying ethical theory, you get a value theory, and you get a normative theory, theory of normativity, and you get an account of how it is that these two theories relate to each other. As we're going to see with John Stuart Mill, they're intimately related to each other, as they are for many philosophers who do ethics. Okay, so ethical theory, there's a lot going on, but two things to hang on to: value theory and normative theory, and they give us different accounts of things. John Stuart Mill, he's a utilitarian. Utilitarianism, okay, generally speaking, as a kind of ethical theory, is an ethical theory that falls out of what's known as the consequentialist tradition, the tradition that endorses consequentialism, the view, as one might guess, that the consequences are what are morally significant when we act. Okay, so consequentialism, as an ethical theory, tells us that our foremost obligation is to bring about good consequences, good enough consequences, or the best consequences, depending on the nature of the consequentialism, as one could guess. Utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism. There are other ways in which one could be a consequentialist, but utilitarianism is one of the ways in which one is a consequentialist. And the traditional way of being utilitarian is to say that the relevant consequences involve utility or happiness. And happiness sometimes gets further defined as pleasure, but again, emphasis on sometimes. Sometimes philosophers don't define happiness in terms of pleasure, but some do. Okay, so utilitarianism is a species of the general theory of consequentialism. It's one of the ways in which one can be a consequentialist. Again, there are others. And the way in which utilitarianism differs from the general consequentialism is it specifies what the good consequences are. The good consequences involve promoting happiness. Okay, so utilitarianism, then, to say a little bit more, it tells us that happiness, surprise, surprise, is what counts as intrinsically good. And it's not just the happiness of a single individual, but rather the happiness of all. So what characterizes utilitarianism as an ethical theory is the fact that it's maintaining that it's the happiness of all that counts as good. Of course, individual happiness is good, but the happiness of all is also intrinsically good. Okay, so they work out their value theory, and they say happiness and the happiness of all count as intrinsically good. Then they say, well, this is our value theory. The value theory entirely determines what the normative theory is in the following way. Once you figure out what counts as intrinsically good, happiness, happiness of all, then you know what your obligations are. You know what your duties are. Remember, a normative theory is a theory of right action. Okay, and a theory of right action tells you how to live your life, the right way to live your life. Okay, so the utilitarian is saying the right way to live our lives, okay, the way we ought to live our lives, right, involves promoting happiness. And traditionally, utilitarians say it's promoting the happiness of all. Okay, so you see how the theories are related. There's a very general feature of consequentialism. The consequentialist says figure out what's intrinsically good, and then what we ought to do is promote those things which count as good. So if you're looking for slogans here for these views, the consequentialist view, the very general view, says promote the good. Utilitarianism says promote happiness. And perhaps more specifically, if we want to just add a bit to the slogan, promote the happiness of of all, of course. So if we're looking for slogans, the slogan for utilitarianism as an ethical theory is promote the happiness of all. And why do we do that? Because our value theory told us that the happiness of all is intrinsically good. Okay, so John Stuart Mill fits in this tradition. John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism is a defense of this view of utilitarianism. So when we go to act, our obligation, in some places Mill says this explicitly, is to maximize the happiness of all. So when we talk about promoting the happiness, we could even go further. The slogan for Mill would be maximize the happiness of all. That's one of the ways in which you can promote the happiness of all, is by maximizing it. So John Stuart Mill is going to say the right action in a circumstance, perhaps any circumstance, is the one that maximizes the happiness of all. Now, there are other utilitarians who don't think we need to go as far as saying maximize the happiness of all. We just have to bring about enough happiness, okay? And we don't need to get into that distinction here. I'm just noting in logical space there are different ways in which one could be utilitarian. We're talking about John Stuart Mill's version here. And there were other traditional utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham, Henry Sidgwick, who thought that maximizing happiness, the happiness of all again, was the thing that utilitarianism tells us to do. Okay, so hopefully we're getting a sense of the view here. So I've done, as I've said, videos on Mill, where he, in utilitarianism, in his work Utilitarianism, develops his value theory. Well, here I'm focusing on the normative theory, but we see how the value theory and the normative theory are really, really intimately connected for someone like, for someone like Mill. Okay, so the structure of utilitarianism is interesting because what Mill says is like, here's the view. It's grounded on developing this value theory, which is hedonistic. So what that means is that happiness is to be defined in terms of pleasure. And after laying this out, Mill goes on to say, well, look, utilitarianism has traditionally been misunderstood as an ethical theory, as a normative theory. So he deals with a whole host of objections to the view, and he thinks that by going through these objections that he can help his reader understand what utilitarianism really is. Okay, now I'm not going to go into like all the back and forth. I'm not going to go into all the objections. I just want to point to one objection that might be worth thinking about here. So sometimes people will challenge utilitarianism like flat-footedly when they first hear the view, and they're just like, well, gosh, it looks like it's awfully demanding, right? That I have to maximize happiness when I go to act, right? It's demanding, perhaps on a couple different fronts. But one way in which it seems demanding is it's going to be very difficult to really promote like the happiness of all, right? When I act, the emphasis on all. And in response to this, John Stuart Mill says this isn't really that big a concern because most of us, when we act, don't affect too many beings, too many people, too many animals. It should be noted that utilitarianism has a kind of like universal perspective on the promotion of happiness of all. Any being whatsoever that can count as happy is one that is a proper subject of the utilitarian principle, at least in terms of patiency, being someone who deserves, as it were, to have their happiness promoted. So this would extend to animals, to members of the animal kingdom. And so the point I'm trying to get at here is that Mill says that when most of us act, we don't affect too many people with our actions, so we seem to be keeping in mind those individuals who we're going to be affecting. Of course, there can be some politicians, world leaders and the like, large corporations, individuals who run corporations, and these kinds of things that can affect lots of people. Well, their obligations go up because they're going to be affecting more people when they act. So the objection that utilitarianism is too demanding because it requires that we maximize the happiness of all, again, emphasis on the all, right, isn't too demanding because all needs to be properly understood, properly qualified, depending on the context in which we find ourselves. And most of us find ourselves in contexts where the all is a relatively small subset of individuals. Okay, those individuals could include human beings and or animals. Okay, so that's one way of understanding, okay, how it is that the theory can be quite demanding. But I want to try to explain how it can be demanding in another way. So the general sort of objection is that utilitarianism, right, it's too demanding as an ethical theory. It puts too much demand on us. Well, another way in which this theory gets understood as being too demanding on us is that sometimes when we go to act, it's going to be difficult to know like whether or not we're promoting the happiness of all, whether or not we're maximizing the happiness of all, right? Things happen too fast for us in many cases, such that we don't have the time to calculate the outcomes or the prospective outcomes to know how to act in a situation. Like, not even with calculators, right, on hand on our smartphones are we going to be able very often to figure out, like, what we're doing is going to bring about the most value in the world, the most happiness in the world, right? And so Mill wants to respond to that by saying, look, we've had a long time in human history. Experience is a great teacher to figure out, okay, which of our actions, right, tend to maximize happiness. Okay, we know the tendencies of our actions. We know when they're going to promote, maximize happiness. And so Mill wants to say that experience has taught us for a very, very long time throughout human history which actions, right, end up counting, right, as the ones that maximize the happiness of all. And he says that experience has then allowed us to form these very general rules that guide us in our behavior. So the utilitarian says that our general obligation is to maximize the happiness of all. That's what Mill seems to be saying. But we have this sort of store, based on learning from experience, of rules, moral rules in place that we can rely on to guide us in 99% of the cases that we find ourselves in. The 1%, okay, the exceptional cases, we're going to have to do some heavy-duty thinking. We're going to have to do some serious reflecting and calculating on what the best outcomes will be in a circumstance. But given that, here we are, right, far, far away from the original humans who started thinking very carefully about ethical issues. We find ourselves in a situation where we, because of past individuals, because of past societies, because of posterity generally, we have access to a storehouse of moral rules that can guide us in our behavior. And we can just rely on those rules in most cases. So we don't have to think about whether telling the truth in most cases is the right thing to do. We don't have to think about whether respecting people's property by not stealing it is the right thing to do in most cases. We don't have to think about whether, right, respecting people's lives, okay, by not taking those lives, right, in circumstances are the right way to go, right? We know they're the right way to go in the majority of cases, right? It's only going to be in the rare cases where we have to think, okay, would it be okay to, say, steal bread, right, from someone, so not respecting their property in this kind of case for the sake of saving individuals' lives, right? Or maybe maybe we need to take a life. This would be something Mill would say. Maybe we have the right in some cases to take someone's life if they're like, a mass murderer or something like that, and who is causing all kinds of unhappiness in society. So think about a Hitler type or a Stalin type or a Pol Pot type here. So in these kinds of cases, like we would be within our rights, according to Mill, to violate the very general moral rules that we've learned throughout history that tend to promote, maximize happiness. Okay, but typically, again, right, the idea is that we follow these moral rules, and those be our guide. So remember, the general objection here was that utilitarianism is too demanding. It's too demanding because it requires that we maximize happiness of emphasis all, okay? But no worries, Mill says, all typically gets qualified in context and ends up being a rather small set of individuals that we need to be looking out for when we act. And then the other way of formulating the objection, the way they're thinking about the objection, as I'm reading Mill here, is I think of it as being too demanding in the sense that it's going to be very difficult in some cases, many cases, it's claimed, to figure out what to do because we don't have the time, etc., to run the relevant calculations to know whether our outcomes, right, are the ones that maximize the happiness of all. And Mill's response there is to say, no worries. There are general moral rules that we can apply in just about every case we find ourselves in. Okay, so that's John Stuart Mill. He's a consequentialist. He's a utilitarian. He's a consequentialist because he says we need to maximize the good. He's a utilitarian because he says that the good is the happiness of all. So his view is that we need to promote the happiness of all. And further, if you see my videos on his value theory and what I've hinted to earlier in this video, he is a hedonistic utilitarian because he thinks that happiness is to be understood in terms of pleasure. So that's John Stuart Mill. Promote the pleasure of all. Okay, we looked at one objection to his view that concludes my video on John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism. Thanks for watching, everybody. Goodbye.